Why is Starfield so divisive? Depending on who you ask, it ranges from 5 out of 10 to 10 out of 10 and plenty of outliers beyond. Critic reviews generally give it a good score, but when you start looking at general audience scores, you see a lot of people scoring on the extremes. Honestly, I find it an incredibly hard game to rate. Overall, I've loved it and dropped 200 hours into it so far, and yet I have a laundry list of complaints. And if you ask me about any one aspect of the game, I'll be able to tell you how flawed or undercooked that part of the game is. What I think makes Starfield so hard to score, and indeed why it's so divisive, is because this game is the definition of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. For each person who plays Starfield, any one of those parts of the game that doesn't quite hit the mark, that's a little broken or undercooked, any one of those parts may well be the part of the game that is the deal breaker for them. Then for others, none of those little parts of the game that aren't perfect aren't deal breakers. They're easily overlooked because very few games offer what Starfield does, what Bethesda RPGs do in general, and that is to bring so many things together into a huge sandbox playground like this. It doesn't matter that some of the writing is bad, or that some NPCs look weird, or that some areas look dodgy, because that other bit of storyline was amazing, and that other NPC is super cool, and that scenic vista took your breath away. And on top of that, there are so many more stories and side quests and secrets and characters and vistas and items and ships and aliens and 100 other things still left to see. And a bunch of those are going to be awesome. So who cares if not all of them are? If you asked me to go through each aspect of the game, each feature or mechanic that the game has, and give it a rating, they'd probably average out to like a 6 or a 7 or something, I'd guess. And yet my overall rating for the game would probably magically end up being a 9 out of 10. I don't really love scoring games in general. I much more strongly favor a qualitative approach, discussing a game and explaining who it appeals to and why, or why it doesn't work well, and so on. I feel this more than ever with Starfield. But let's do a bit of an experiment. Let's go through each part of the game, I'll score it and share some brief thoughts on it, and then I'll average out those scores. Then we'll compare to my purely emotional 100% biased rating, which is a 9 out of 10. Before we begin, it's my ethical obligation to mention before I review my opinions on Starfield that I had a sponsorship to cover the game at launch. It included making 2 videos and 10 hours total of streaming time. Take into consideration that it could color my opinions. I don't feel like it does, but if you disagree with my opinions, you might feel like that explains it. I mean, it's pretty obvious that I've enjoyed the game, given that I've played 190 hours more than I was sponsored to do, and that I've made like 13 more videos than I was contracted to make. But it's my ethical duty to explain this potential bias either way. So let's start with visuals. On the pros, the game has impressive detail in clutter and an amazing variety of beautiful vistas on moons and planets. The game is downright gorgeous at times and makes for really good screenshotting. On the negatives, however, there's some really blown out lighting to the point of headache, and some very weird looking NPCs at times. There's also some nearly unforgivable technical issues or oversights like missing brightness and contrast sliders that are slated to be fixed, to be fair. The first city you visit is kind of the worst looking, and that will color a lot of people's overall thoughts as well, as you have to kind of go exploring to see the best the game has to offer. My overall score on visuals is 7 out of 10, it's quite the mixed bag. Next, let's talk about what the game offers in terms of storylines, quests and writings, themes and things like that. There's a huge variety of sci-fi tropes and flavors to sample here like a buffet, with some decent storytelling at times, especially in the UC Vanguard. On the flip side though, there is some very weird and awkward dialogue and nonsensical storytelling, and then there's some really disappointing moments of player decision-making options where certain options that feel like they exist just don't, or aren't really accounted for or are done in weird ways. There's been plenty of side quests and even some main quests where I've been kind of disappointed by the ending or some of the decisions we've been able to make throughout. As an aside, the main story quest seems to be somewhat divisive because it departs heavily from the grounded sci-fi that the game initially displays with its NASA punk aesthetic. I personally actually loved what the main story and New Game Plus does in the game, and it was kind of my favorite part of the storytelling quests overall, but I actually totally get people not liking it for going all space magic. Personally, I enjoy my sci-fi to have some ancient artifacts and strange, mysterious things and philosophical bantering and whatnot. Overall, for story and quest lines, I give it a 7 out of 10. There is definitely some high points and then some frustrating low points. One of the biggest pros, of course, is just that there's so much content here. Next up, combat. It's got quite solid and fun RPG shooting combat with great progression in weapons and skills. Jetpacking around is a lot of fun, and the spoiler abilities add an optional fun extra layer. Utility items like grenades and combat stims and social combat abilities are effective and fun to use. On the negative side, it's good RPG combat, but it's not good by shooter standards, with limited to no bullet physics and cover working poorly at best. Melee is quite lacking compared to ranged options, and sometimes while enemy AI can feel clever at times, it will then have situations where there's an enemy just staring at a corner while you shoot them over and over. Overall, I give the combat an 8 out of 10. It's pretty good RPG combat within that context, but it's not a shooting sim. Combat score, I think, will be at the mercy of people's expectations here. If they go into it expecting a shooting sim, they're going to be disappointed. We can't not talk about spaceships, so spaceship building is really cool, with tons of parts and lots of variety in what can be achieved. People have been making some very impressive looking ships. Upgrading your ship is very fun and satisfying, and it's cool that you can board and hijack other ships too. Ships are actually the most effective and usable player home system Bethesda has ever come up with. I always loved the idea of player housing in Bethesda games, but never really actually found them usable. I guess making sure that they just go with you wherever you go is the best solution in the end. Now, ship combat, while fun overall, does feel limited in player skill impact, and that's because enemy fire is basically unavoidable. Evasive maneuvering doesn't seem to do anything, and there is a strange lack of anti-missile or anti-lock features such as chaff countermeasures and so on. Overall though, because it's such a great player housing system effectively and the spaceship building is just really cool, I give it an 8 out of 10. It's a shame the combat isn't just a little bit better because it's almost there. Next up, resource gathering and base building, as this is a major feature the game kind of advertised. Exploring and scouting locations is fun, and there's a ton of resources to be found here, and I was pretty excited about this system. Unfortunately, however, the entire resource system and base building is nearly redundant and pointless. It's deep enough to be confusing to someone who engages casually, but it's too shallow to appeal to Factorio players, with a lack of production line sorting options and so on. It's also really high investment to get into it, and just very low payoff in the end, unless you're using it for exploits. Building outposts as player homes is also strangely limited, especially compared to Fallout titles. Overall, I rate the resource gathering and base building a 4 out of 10. It does seem that earlier designs of the game, where fuel and environmental hazards were going to be more important and played a larger role in the gameplay, outposts would have made more sense and served a larger purpose. Base building and resource gathering being optional is fine for the game, but the way it is now means that players who do choose to engage with it won't feel very rewarded for their efforts, unless they're using it to exploit infinite XP. There's just no real payoff here. Hopefully a survival mode is added in the future and the system makes a lot more sense. Next up, character skills and gear progression. This is an RPG after all. There's a ton of highly desirable skills and no limit to eventually getting them. Never have I ever played a game like this where I delayed getting combat skills for so long just because there was so many interesting non-combat skills to invest in. It's very cool. From the perspective of someone who plays a lot of loot-driven action RPGs, gear progression here is quite effective and loot hunting is fun. New Game Plus also offers a way to reset your gear and the world, and then to keep progressing your skills and your character in a way where the story and the world somewhat accounts for that fact, which is fun. On the negative, some skills are basically mandatory, so everyone will get them, and others feel kind of pointless. The pointless ones are often kind of tied in with the issues with balance on things like food and the resource collecting and base building. So if those things improve or change in a survival mode, some of those pointless feeling skills will be a lot better. A significant issue with gear at the higher end of gameplay is that there is no sort of low-end gear drop tapering off in higher end content, so that means that all too often you'll find the crappiest Ripshank knife as a legendary drops in from level 90 enemies or something. That's unfortunate and a common problem with RPGs, unfortunately, but a mod could probably fix this quite easily in the future. Overall, I give character skills and gear progression a 9 out of 10. I've been having a blast progressing my characters and hunting new guns and suits and making credits and so on. It's the best it's been in a Bethesda RPG in my opinion. Finally, exploration. There's a huge variety of planets and near limitless exploration that you can do. I was especially impressed with the alien wildlife and just how many cool and interesting looking creatures there are. There's not that much to actually do with them apart from just kill them and collect some resources that don't serve too much purpose, but it is very cool, the designs of them and just how much variety there is here. There is also insane amounts of hidden side quests and various encounters to discover. A lot of players actually miss a lot of this stuff because they don't spend too much time hopping around in space, so there might be more than what you think. On the flip side, however, for exploration, there is far weaker environmental storytelling here than in previous Bethesda RPGs, and that was always a high point of the game, so that is disappointing. The nature of space travel also makes everything feel a lot more contained and isolated. Of course, the discussion about things like load screens and fast travel has kind of been beaten to death. Personally, that stuff doesn't really bother me that much, but you're never really going to have those moments where you're exploring around and you stumble across something that's not marked out as a point of interest. That's not some sort of contained thing that was procedurally placed there. And that's unfortunate. There does just seem to be a lot more content reuse in this game than ever before, and that means you can quickly start to notice repeated locations if you engage in the procedural generation system too much. Overall, I give exploration a 6 out of 10. More points of interest and a system where you won't see the same point of interest layout again for a long time after exploring it, I think would help a lot here though. So maybe that's something that can be patched or modded in the near future. So if we average my score for each part of the game, we get an average of 7 out of 10, which is kind of what I expected. But my biased, gut feeling emotional rating was 9 out of 10. I just really enjoyed the game so much overall, despite my grievances with each specific part of it. My score seems illogical. One theory that I have is that a lot of the problems I listed are softened. They're watered down amongst the scope of what the game offers, and all of the parts of what I really did enjoy. I can forgive a lot when I feel like there's a lot of stuff I really liked, or that there is still more fun things left to discover. And even after 200 hours, I still feel that way. There's some main questlines I still haven't even touched. Another theory that I kind of discovered in the process of doing this analysis is that my highest scored feature is one of the most important ones to me: gear and character progression. It's quite possible that as long as the most important part of the game for each player feels like it's done well, then that player will be pretty happy. And conversely though, if someone's most important feature was going to be base building, for example, it probably doesn't matter to them how good the rest of the game is. I don't know which of the theories is most accurate here, or if it's somewhat of a mixture of the two. In the end, I think Starfield goes beyond the normal ratings are subjective issue when it comes to review scores. And I think that's just because it's such a big game that has so many things with which it can appeal to players, and conversely, to disappoint them with. And I think a big factor for people that end up really liking Starfield is that there's just not really many other games like it. Few other developers make these big 3D open world RPGs on this scope. They're really rare. But what do you folks think? Is it a bad game and the people giving it 9s and 10s are delusional fanboys? Are the people giving it 4s and 5s just haters? Or do you think that maybe I've somewhat touched on here what makes it such a complicated game to score? Anyway, thanks for attending my TED Talk. I'm Ziggy D, and thanks for watching.